underrated aspect of that is that could be harder than actually starting.
Where the pitfalls may be and hopefully give you a much better outcome.
Hi, I'm Dorian Lamb, and welcome to Season 2 of Start with the Close in Mind. In real estate, business, and life, the people who win aren't the ones who react. They prepare, they think ahead, they see the close long before the rest of the room does. After a year of conversations with top operators and decision makers, this season goes even deeper into what it takes to close deals the right way. We'll break down the strategies, the mistakes, the mindset, and the real stories that reveal how successful people navigate complexity and come out on top. Every episode brings insights from leaders who have been in the trenches and can show you the difference between hoping a deal closes and engineering the outcome from the start. This is Season 2 of Start with the Close in Mind. Let's dive in. Welcome to the next episode of Start with the Close in Mind. Today's episode focuses on something that doesn't get talked about enough in real estate: execution. A lot of conversations in our industry focus on acquisitions, financing, and getting deals across the finish line. But the reality is that closing a deal is really just the beginning. What happens after the closing is what ultimately determines whether an investment succeeds or fails. My guest today is Michael Mintz, founder and CEO of MD² Property Group, an operating platform that manages over 150 buildings and thousands of apartments across multiple markets. Michael sits on the execution side of the business. His work focuses on property management, capital improvements, operational efficiency, and the systems required to run large multifamily portfolios. Today, we're going to talk about what actually drives value after a deal closes, where investors misunderstand value-add execution, and what it takes to scale a real estate operating platform. Michael, welcome to the show. Let's start with a little background about you and how you built MD².
Dorian, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today. So I had been at a large property management company in New York City. And in 2014, after being there for about 7 years, decided it was time to do my own thing. They had become very corporate, and just for me, I did not feel that was the right environment for me to excel. So in 2014, I left and I founded MD². We started off actually picking up one client very quickly after I left, who I had actually met through the transaction of him buying a building from an owner that I managed for at the old company I was at. He ended up liking me when I left and started my own firm. He asked me if I'd manage his building. We took that on, and then slowly started building our practice from there. As you mentioned earlier, we now manage over 150 buildings and over 5,000 apartments. We also manage close to 1 million square feet of office, and we are in a couple of different markets, primarily New York City. That's really where our expertise is. We have a very strong expertise in understanding rent stabilization and some of the nuances around that and how to navigate the system in New York. But we also do manage some properties up in Connecticut, some properties in Pennsylvania, and a little bit in New York.
So you branched off and launched your own platform on what sounds like the preface of just being more flexible, more dynamic. At what point did you realize that you were building something larger?
So the truth is, I don't know. In reality, I don't think it was a conscious decision. I think a lot of that just kind of happened. So we were working, like I said, for that one client. While we were working for that one client, we met someone else who was buying some smaller buildings in New York City. He hired us to manage his building. He ended up buying 2 more that we managed for him. And then he had a good experience with us to start referring us to others. And I'd say relatively quickly, we started being referred around to the point where we started to build a nice number of units and a nice number of buildings without really having to put money into marketing or put a lot of effort on that side. It was really just providing a good quality product, and that product is what led to a good outcome. Excuse me. I will tell you one interesting thought that I'm having right now thinking about your question. And I know part of this conversation is going to be about how we scaled and whatnot. And I will say scaling was much harder than the initial phase. During the initial phase, when I was doing all the work myself, we would get referrals just right and left. It was just very easy because the quality of work was so high. As we started growing and we had to hire others and we had to train others to replicate kind of my knowledge and what I was doing, that's where it starts becoming more challenging. And honestly, I'm sure later on in the conversation, we'll get into some of the things that we did to try to train others and put best practices in place and really create the strongest team possible that allows us to succeed the way that we're succeeding, because it is about people at the end of the day. And without good people behind me, I wouldn't be able to do it. But I will say the marketing efforts were much more minimal when we were smaller and it was me doing it than what we need now when we have a whole team that we're trying to feed.
That's very interesting and a very good point, because it's the beginning of it actually can at times be easier because it's you doing everything, like you just mentioned. And I think there's a really good point to be taken away here, that when you scale, everybody talks about scaling and everybody talks about things like 10x scaling and exponential scaling. But the underrated aspect of that is that could be harder than actually starting the company, because it's
Much
finding
harder.
the right people. Because
Much harder,
you're right.
especially in a services business like this, right? Like if I was a tech company where I had a product that I know would perform the same way, you put in a certain input, you're going to get the same output every time, right? Then yes, that's easy to scale. And that's why tech companies tend to be valued at these huge multiples. But when you're in a service business, it's all about your people. And no matter how much training we put in place, no matter how many procedures and processes and whatnot we put in place, to get people to take that same input and always put out the same output is impossible. It's just not going to happen. And so you try to get as close to that same output. You try to get it within kind of a certain kind of materiality threshold, that output, so you're getting it kind of within the range of what you think is acceptable. But to get the exact same output is very difficult. And so 100% you're right that scaling a service business is much harder than starting a service business. Starting a service business, I needed no capital up front. I left my old job. I literally rented a small office, had to buy a computer, right? It was almost nothing that I needed up front to start the business. And honestly, the first couple of years of the business, I made a lot more money than I made in subsequent years after that, because anything that came in was feeding me, right? Because I was doing all the work. Once I started to have to hire employees, that's where all of a sudden your margins get thinner, everything gets more complicated, your insurance costs go up, right? Your overhead goes up, everything starts going up, and the scaling of a service business is much harder than starting it.
Yeah. So you've already reflected on the journey as an entrepreneur. And we could probably have a whole separate show about operating systems and how we go about implementing and creating a structure by which you can really identify where the right people belong and where you need the right people. But I'll leave it at just your point, which is it is all about the people, right? So for the entrepreneurs out there, it always boils down to people. So it's about talent and aligning yourself with that talent and getting them on board and keeping them, right? But because today's show is more about real estate, I want to kind of stick to your platform, where we talked about what the origination of, or at least the origination of that journey, and you starting it and then you scaling it. Once you're operating at scale, execution is always important, but now execution is front and center, not just in the company itself, but also with the properties that you're managing, right? I want to move towards the execution aspect of what you do and what you help landowners accomplish. Investors, they love to talk about value add deals, right? All the time. You hear that. And from your perspective, right? We'll talk about later what that means, but from your perspective, in the spirit of start with the close in mind, what do people misunderstand about executing a value add deal?
Well, so I think a lot of what people misunderstand when they just look at it on paper, and truthfully, you have a lot of people who are coming from kind of the investor capital side of the business that come into the syndication business where they buy these value add properties. And oftentimes I find that they come in thinking that the lift required to actually successfully execute this is not complicated. They think you allocate enough money and it just gets done. You
Right.
just give some instructions and it gets done. Honestly, that's been one of the biggest challenges, because when we come into a lot of these situations, especially with operators and syndicators who have not done many deals, they're sitting there negotiating heavily with us on fees and trying to kind of squeeze us down to where there's just no meat on the bones. And then they want us to perform at this high level, but they don't understand that if we want to perform at that high level, we need to have, once again, what we said before, people, right, that we can have on the team that will perform at that level. And so to your point, a lot of it really is about having a strong team, having capable people, but also having the resources to make sure you can maintain those people. So a lot of the conversations we have up front is talking with people about fees and helping them to understand, hey, if you want a 3% fee, then this is what we can offer for that. If you're willing to go up to a 4 or 5% fee, then we can offer this, and this person is going to have these additional skills. And so that I would say is something that a lot of people come in there looking at the pro forma numbers. And look, the truth is, as we know, a lot of lenders, a lot of operators will tell you all the time, property management shouldn't be over a 3% cost. The reality is, when you're doing smaller deals, it's always going to be over a 3% cost. And whoever's telling you that it shouldn't be over a 3% cost, they've never operated, because they don't understand that just to hire Look, I'll tell you, before COVID, we had a lot of property managers who were making kind of 80, 90,000 a year, and they were fine with that. So truthfully, maybe you can make sense of where the rents were and getting around those 3% fees. Nowadays,
Right.
most of our property managers want kind of mid six figure salaries. They're not looking to get into the business to make 80 or $90,000. And so the reality is that money to pay them has to come from somewhere. And so unless you want to give them a much bigger workload, which then once again with a bigger workload, they're probably not going to perform at the same level. The fees have to go up to make sense of that. And so I'll say that's probably the biggest challenge that I find in the industry, that most people and most syndicators, and then unfortunately it's backed up by lenders who also set these arbitrary rules about what they'll pay in management fees. They end up setting up deals for failure because they want these bottom of the barrel management companies, which there are some of those out there, but I will say those companies generally are trying to find other ways to make money off of you. So they're not focusing on management, and they don't ultimately give you a good service on the management.
Yeah, really interesting point, right? And we may come back around to that, but that 3% fee is almost like a underwriting rule of thumb that everybody applies literally. And the importance of the execution aspect of it is it shouldn't be tied to paying the cheapest price to who is maintaining and actually managing your property, right? Because if you give a little more, and when I say a little, you can, that's an arbitrary kind of statement, but even if you went from 3% to 5% arbitrarily, what you would be saving and gaining in terms of the efficiency of your building is going to be much higher than the extra 2% there, right?
That's
Just to
right.
kind of give
That's right.
a
Like
little.
we and to build off of that, Dorian. So we have clients that sometimes will say they want to do the project management themselves. Some of them I will say have the sophistication and the knowledge to be able to actually get done and execute on the apartment renovations themselves well. But I'd say many of them do not. And many of them come back to us after 6 months or 8 months of them trying to do it and just becoming a big mess and say, hey, can you step in now to try to resolve this? And I will say it becomes a mess. They're trying to save a couple of percent on the project management side, but ultimately, the fact that they can't rent these apartments timely, the fact that there's issues when they do rent them and tenants want concessions, right? The fact that they are having issues with contractors. They have contractors sometimes walk off the job and then they have to bring on new contractors. All this costs them money. And so to your point, everyone thinks, oh, let me try to squeeze a buck here or there. But in the end of the day, usually that squeezing of a dollar ends up costing them more money.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, another great point, Mike. So, you covered a couple of instances where that value add business plan can go wrong. Now, let's shift to what decisions can help, right? So what are the operational decisions that you have seen and that you promote that actually drive positive returns?
Yeah, so I think first of all, I think being realistic with your budgeting. I think that's a huge one. Don't just try to follow what the standard lender or market guidelines are. Look at what actual operating costs are in the market. Because I will say, at least my experience is oftentimes those guidelines that people get, whether it's from brokers, whether it's from lenders, are just completely detached from reality of the market. So look at the real numbers. I know for a lot of our clients, we recommend that they reach out to us before they buy a property. We're happy to help them put together a pro forma budget. We'll compare it to similar buildings that we have so we can look at what the real true market operating costs are and give them those numbers. And then they can do a true analysis to see whether they like the deal or not when they start seeing the real market numbers. I think that's kind of a big part of it. Secondly, I would say that do not always use the cheapest contractors. So on the value add side, when people are renovating apartments and whatnot, we find oftentimes a lot of our clients will go out to bid, and then whoever's the lowest price bidder is the person they're going to go with. My experience is that oftentimes the lowest price bidder is not going to get the project done in time, is going to have a lot of change orders, is going to create a lot of issues that ultimately over time is going to bring you less value than the price difference between the lowest price and the middle price bidders. So I think
And
it's kind of
that's something you can help guide owners as well on, right?
100%. We could help guide owners with that. We also have contractors that we've worked with quite a bit that we can recommend to our clients and owners. But overall, you're 100% right that that's something we can help them with. But those are the types of things that I think if people are thoughtful with, they can avoid a lot of headaches throughout their projects.
That's a great tip. I feel the advice you gave regarding engage with the property manager early is almost like the advice that you can recommend across industry. I say it all the time from the perspective of my company, where the earlier you get us involved, the better. So it's almost like we can morph this to not just start with the close in mind, but start with success of your property in mind. So general advice on the service side is engage your partners and advisors earlier. It doesn't hurt, right? Now,
100%. And then, Dorian, the other thing that I would just note, the other partner and advisor that I would recommend engaging early is also legal counsel. We've seen a lot of our clients who will jump into a project, jump into a renovation. They go and renovate a unit thinking that it's deregulated or whatever it is.
right.
And then afterward, they find out that, oh, this actually was a regulated unit. You just put all this money into it and you can't actually even raise the rent. Or you can't raise rent very much. Obviously, with the new guidelines, you can raise it, but
Yeah.
it's pretty limited.
Yes,
And so
stay out of the news is what you were saying.
well, stay out of the news for sure. But even more than staying out of the news to protect yourself, I strongly encourage everyone to engage with their legal counsel ahead of time because their legal counsel will help to advise them of where the pitfalls may be and hopefully give you a much better outcome than otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, speaking of, stay out of the news, we don't have to get too deep in this, but just so that the listeners can understand, how much should they consider the regulatory environment in terms of how it influences how you operate the property?
That's right. And so I think you have to consider the regulatory environment pretty heavily with how you operate the property. Obviously, first of all, you need to act within the constraints of the law, and the laws in New York are ever changing. So part of understanding the environment is not just the regulatory environment, but the political environment to understand where the laws are going and try to predict that to some extent. Because do understand I do understand that if you do not predict where the politics are going properly, you may end up in a situation where you bought a property, you're expecting to be able to execute on a certain business plan, and now you're being limited on the business plan that you could execute on, which will cause you a lot of issues for an extended period of time. Sharing personal experiences, I had bought some buildings in 2018. I went into them and I would say I did not predict enough what was going to happen with the HSTPA in 2019. And I bought buildings that I was expecting to be able to continue to work with tenants to relocate them and renovate units and deregulate units. And unfortunately, that all got stalled in the middle. And now I have some buildings that are truthfully just studs. I can't figure out what to do with them. No one wants to give loans on them and trying to figure that one out. So that definitely becomes a really big burden with these type of deals, especially in New York where the laws could change so drastically. It's just really important to be very attuned with that.
Yeah. Sorry to hear that, right? And it's a lesson that it seems like you've learned firsthand in terms of engaging the experts early, right? And especially legal counsel, and be mindful of kind of who is in place from the regulatory standpoint and what their missions are and how things can really change on the dime, right? And obviously there's certain timing mechanisms to that, but it does pay to really factor that in. And to be very truthful, it's why there are a fair amount of investors that are, shying away from states like ourselves here in New York, where the sentiment and the narrative is such that it is so. And I'm not saying if it's wrong or right, there's a lot of proof that it is correct, but that New York is such a tenant forward or anti-landlord forward, city. So it does really highlight the importance of actually engaging with the likes of you who have been in line with it through the years and who kind of understand where it could potentially go,
But
right?
I think that's right. And I don't know how much politics you want to get into here. Happy to talk more politics if you'd like. I think that's exactly right. New York does tend to be right now on the pendulum. It's leaning very much towards kind of the overcorrection towards protecting tenants to a point where it is making it very difficult to be a landlord and potentially leading people to not want to be landlords in New York City. But once again, to your point, if you're gonna play in the game in New York City, it is very important that you engage with your professionals early. You understand kind of where the market's going and what's expected, and then you define your business plan based off of the realities of the market.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we go back to one of the original questions, which is what makes a good business plan or what makes a business plan successful. And, what you just essentially highlighted is that it has to survive real world application, right? It's not just on paper. So on that note, what would you say just to get those who have not owned and operated buildings before, what does the day-to-day reality of managing portfolio look like? Is it, and to add more to this is one of the remarks you made earlier is that, many people feel like they could just do it on their own. And there's, some truth in that, as you said, with some of the more sophisticated folks. But at the end of the day, it's, time is money. And if your strategy is to build a portfolio of units, you need to be spending more time finding that than managing the property, right? So sometimes that should be left off to the experts. But at the same time, there's some level of underestimating what it looks like to manage a day-to-day property. So what would you say is, or what does the day-to-day reality of managing multifamily look like?
Yeah, so the truth is, just on the management side, so taking out the capital improvement side and the value add side, but just on the management side, generally we structure all of our buildings where there's a team where you have a property manager and an assistant. The property manager tends to be responsible for kind of the bigger picture, and the planning items, in addition to most of your site visits. We do require that our managers generally visit most buildings once a week. We believe that without visiting a building, you can't be proactive in terms of maintaining the building, in terms of addressing whether there's light bulbs out, whether there's, door closers that aren't working right, whether there's dirty hallways, whether there's a
Yeah.
leak, right? If you're not going there, you're not going to see those things early, and then you become completely dependent on residents to let you know when there's an issue, and then you're responsive with your management, which is never a great place to be. So,
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
in other words, you're in the weeds. It's not, and not only that are you in the weeds, it's a very reactive and emotional aspect of it, right? Because whomever is reaching out to you, their problem is their biggest problem, right?
Yep.
And it can get very, we'll say, high pressured, or we'll say very quickly, crazy, right? But we'll use that word.
Yep. No, that's right. And I'll tell you, people ask me often what's the difference between commercial management and residential management. And honestly, that's exactly right. To your point, when it's commercial management and someone calls you, okay, they have a toilet that needs to be addressed. You get someone out there in half an hour or whatever. That's totally fair time frame. They're totally good with it. When someone calls you from their personal apartment, they want someone out instantaneously. They have no patience. They want it dealt with right away. And this is the biggest priority in the world.
Right.
And so that's really the big difference. And you're 100% right. There's a lot of pressure that's put on you with residential management because of the fact that people want things addressed right away. And I know one of the things that you said we were going to talk a little bit about was what's something that people don't understand in the management space. And this is more, I'd say, from the resident side than the ownership side. But on the resident side, it tends to become a very frustrating thing in the business because residents kind of call you and they think somehow that our managers have nothing else that they have to be doing. So when a resident has something going on in their apartment, everything should be dropped and it should be dealt with right away. We do try to treat all of our clients as if they're the most important person, and we train our managers to do that. But at the same point, there's the reality of having to juggle that with everything else and everyone
Right.
else that's asking you to kind of get these things done. And so that is one thing that I do oftentimes wish that the outside world understood better about property management, that all of us want to help everyone, right?
Yeah.
You call your property manager. It's not that your property manager does not want to run over to your apartment right then to address your issue. They would love to if they could. But unfortunately, there's 10 other residents that are asking them also to run over to their apartment right now and fix their issue. So they've got to figure out, how do I prioritize it? Who can I send over? Because I don't have the time to run over myself and deal with all this, right? And how do I get those people over in a timely manner to all these apartments so that everyone gets taken care of? And at the end of the day, we really make a very concerted effort to make sure everyone's getting taken care of, that everything's being tracked, that we're on top of it all. But I will say that unfortunately, it doesn't always happen as quickly as our managers or the resident would like. But I wish people understood more that we would love it if we could have someone out there immediately. We would love it if we could be out there ourselves to fix it immediately. But just the reality of buildings and building systems and the fact that over time, every building is going to have things that are going to break. You're trying to juggle all of this at the same time. And unfortunately, you can't always address everyone's concerns as quickly as they'd like.
Yeah, I actually categorize it in the thankless job arena, right? It is a very underrated, element or the part of the business that you're in, because it's somewhat thankless. Everybody's, perception is that their problem is the most important, that you must address it. So it's a juggle, and it's something that many should really think about in terms of just how they treat their property managers and how they view their property managers, right? So, you now operate at scale. And, we've talked about the entrepreneurial journey of starting a company. We've now received and heard insight from you in terms of just the effectiveness of business plan execution and, how to, in essence, operate and manage a property, right? So let's kind of bring them together. What would you say is the difference between managing properties and building a company?
Yeah, so I think truthfully, managing properties, I would say in general, is more straightforward. A lot of it has to do with mechanical systems. A lot of it has to do with kind of physical plant issues. There is obviously bigger picture capital planning and things like that, but much of managing buildings is a much more, I'd say, decision and impact type of situation. With growing a company, especially as the number of employees increases, my experience is there are certain thresholds that you hit where the decision does not have the same impact as it had previously when you made a similar decision. So, like, for example, I'd say once we got over 20 employees or something like that, when we were under 20 employees, there were a lot of things that we can do to kind of say, hey guys, let's put a little bit more effort in. Let's kind of work a little bit harder. Let's stay a little bit later to get this stuff done. And everyone felt like they were part of a family and everyone kind of was
Yeah.
more than happy to put in that effort. Once you get over a certain number of employees, it's just impossible to create that type of environment.
Right.
And you fight to try to keep that type of environment, but at a certain point you realize you're just not going to be able to have that environment. So then you've got to figure out, how do we put other systems in place to try to get similar outcomes, similar output, just through different methods of getting there. And so at least my experience is that growing a company is not as clear of an input leads to a specific output as running a building. Running a building, I'd say most of the problems are solved through specific solutions that you know what the outcome will be from that solution. And once again, there are nuances to this. There obviously are anomalies to this, especially once you start involving a lot of staff in a building and stuff like that. But growing a company is really driven by your people. And as you get to certain sizes, you do not always get the same output from the people as you got at a smaller size based on the same input.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're both very difficult. And, I think one of the conclusions that we can both make is, we mentioned it at the top of the show, but it really is about the people. And, it's a big people kind of party overall between
100%.
operating a
So I'll tell
company.
you, Dorian, we have three kind of core elements of our business. We say it's people, process, and technology, right? Those are the three elements of our business. And so the technology helps to support the people, the process helps to support the people. But without good people who want to learn and be helped by that process and technology, your residents are never going to have a good experience. And so it really is, at the end of the day, completely about the people.
I love that. PPT, and specifically in that order, people, process, technology, right?
That's right.
So let's start closing the show. What advice would you give someone entering the operational side of real estate?
So to the point that we said before, don't grow too large. I
Yeah.
would have a lot less headaches if we were smaller. And I do sometimes think back and wish I just stayed as a one-man shop. So that is definitely something that I would say to consider. Unless you have ambitions of creating a large company that you want to sell. I would say if it's just kind of you're looking to kind of have an operating business that brings in some income while you buy buildings yourself, I'd say you may want to stay smaller and not necessarily take every opportunity to grow. But I would also say find great people to work with, right? Like if you can find really good people to be your right-hand guy, your left-hand guy, right? And all the people that kind of come with you as you grow, those people who are backing you up are going to be the people who are going to ultimately make you a success or a failure. I'm actually very lucky. I have as my right-hand person, Yuval Platner. He's my COO.
Yeah.
He's incredible, and I would never have been able to grow the business the way I have without him. Adam Reisman, my president of client services, is incredible. We've really built a very strong team. And as we keep building that team, without these people, I cannot grow it to the same level. And so I would say find people that you really can count on, you really will rely on, and then grow with those people, because that's what's going to ultimately make it possible to get to that next level.
Nothing is more fun growing with, doing business with like-minded people, and people that you like and that like you, value each other, trust each other. There couldn't be more truth in that across all facets of professional.
Well, and Dorian, I would add in there the like portion I may take out of the statement you just said, because I will say I tend to be a relatively passionate person. There are definitely times that I do not like my team members and I get very frustrated with them. But the trust portion that you said is to me the most important thing, because I have just endless trust for them. And even when I'm upset at them, even when I would tell you in the moment, I don't like them, I'm really upset at them now, I still have tremendous trust for them with them. And generally it leads to us having I would say, passionate debate to figure out kind of what's our best path forward. And sometimes that debate can lead to hurt feelings, but it's okay. Those hurt feelings move on. And by the next day, you're good and you move forward. But the reason we can move forward is because there is tremendous trust between us.
100%. Open and honest, right?
That's right.
And I agree with that. I said like-minded, but I agree with that. You don't always like people. You just have to know that you trust each other. And that's part of being like-minded, right? Because you're all going to congregate together to understand what the objective is, what the goals are, and to work together at that, right?
That's right. That's right.
So Mike, you've already given us so much time. Where can listeners find you or learn more about MD Squared?
Yeah, so if you want to follow me specifically, first of all, you can go to our website, www.md2pg.com. So www.md2pg.com. You can find my contact information there and everything. You could also follow me if you want. I would say I don't post very much, but on both Instagram and Twitter at Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota originally, and my last name is Mintz. So at Minnesota.
Yeah.
And then also you can find MD Squared on Instagram at MD2propertygroup.com hashtag MD2propertygroup. And yeah, but our website also has all information. So that's probably the easiest place to find any of it.
Yeah. And I'll drop that information into the comments too, so that people don't have to rewind on this. But Mike, thank you so much. Today we learned something important. Closing a deal doesn't determine success always. Execution does, in terms of especially a business plan working. So things like operations, systems, people, leadership, they are what ultimately drives performance. And when you start with the close in mind, or start with wanting to be successful in mind in real estate, you have to design deals that are actually built to work when you get the right people involved, and get them involved sooner than later. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Start with the close in mind. See you in the next episode.